I bought a vintage book. Inside was a letter to me dated 1915. I never believed in destiny. At 42, I figured myself to be a practical woman, an architect from Portland, Oregon, who lived a pretty quiet life and picked up books at estate sales, just for the love of reading. But that Sunday in October turned my whole world upside down. The flea market over at Laurelhurst Park was where I'd spend most Sunday mornings. You know how it is, wandering through all those tables loaded with vintage china, old vinyl records, and little treasures folks were parting with. That particular day, this elderly lady's book table caught my eye. She had everything laid out real nice. Paperback romance novels, old history books, you name it. But one book just called to me. This thick volume bound in chocolate brown leather with fancy gold lettering across the spine. The title read, Mysteries of the Human Mind, in old-fashioned Gothic script, written by some Dr. Edward Hartwell back in 1912. Between them was tucked an envelope, thick, cream-colored, clearly antique. The wax seal was partially preserved, but the coat of arms on it had worn away with time. I nearly dropped the book in surprise. On the front of the envelope, in elegant calligraphy, was written, Miss Sarah Edmonds. That was my name, my full name, which I only used on official documents. In everyday life, everyone called me simply Sarah. In the upper right corner of the envelope was a date, March 3rd, 1915. My heart began beating faster. This had to be someone's strange joke. But the envelope looked genuinely old. The paper had yellowed, the edges were slightly frayed, and the wax had darkened with time. I carefully broke the seal. Inside lay a sheet of paper covered in the same calligraphic handwriting. The letter began with the words, Dear Sarah, and contained information that made my blood run cold. The author knew that I would find this book in October 2024, at age 42, living alone in Portland after a divorce 3 years ago. He knew that I worked as an architect at the firm Miller & Partners and visited the flea market in Laurelhurst Park every Sunday. But the most shocking part came next. The letter's author described small details of my life known only to me. The scar on my left knee from falling off a bicycle at age 7, the stuffed bear named Mr. Brown I still sleep with, my habit of buying coffee at Stamford Cafe every Tuesday, and always ordering a cinnamon latte without sugar. The author introduced himself as Joseph Edmonds, my great-great-grandfather on my mother's side. He explained that my grandmother Elizabeth had been his granddaughter, though she never knew the truth about her origins. Circumstances had forced the family to separate, and many connections were lost. Joseph wrote about a family gift of foresight that had been passed down through the bloodline through many generations. According to him, I was an heir to this gift and should prepare for important events. The letter warned that on Sunday, October 27th, 2024, a stranger named Thomas Winters would come to my home, identifying himself as a representative of the Genealogical Research Society. I shouldn't fear him. He would bring documents that would change my understanding of myself and my place in the world. At the end of the letter was a mysterious postscript. Mr. Brown the bear is not just a toy. Look under his right paw. You'll find another surprise there. My hands were shaking when I finished reading. This was impossible. Absolutely impossible. No one could know about Mr. Brown, about Stamford Cafe, about the scar on my knee. These details were known only to me. I got up and went to the bedroom. On the nightstand sat a worn brown bear, my faithful companion since childhood. Joseph Edmonds really existed. Records remained in the University of Oregon archives about a psychology professor with that name who died in 1915 under mysterious circumstances. Newspapers of that time wrote about him as a mystical scientist and researcher of paranormal phenomena. And I began noticing oddities in my behavior. On Tuesday at Stamford Cafe, I automatically ordered a cinnamon latte without sugar, though I always thought I preferred Americano. The barista smiled and noted that I was ordering as usual. As usual? I had never ordered a cinnamon latte before, but somehow this taste seemed familiar, homey. On Wednesday, I dreamed that my neighbor, Mrs. Hanson, would fall on the stairs and break her arm. In the morning, leaving for work, I met her by the mailboxes and offered to help carry her heavy bag. She was surprised by my thoughtfulness, but agreed. Later, it turned out that the steps were indeed slippery due to morning dew. On Thursday, during a meeting with a client, I suddenly felt that he was hiding important information about the project budget. My intuition proved correct. An hour later, he admitted that the company was on the verge of bankruptcy and couldn't pay the full cost of the work. By Friday, I could no longer deny the obvious. Something in me was really changing. Dreams became brighter and often came true. My intuition sharpened so much that I could sense people's moods without looking at their faces. Saturday passed in anticipation. The letter promised that Thomas Winters would come on Sunday. Part of me hoped this wouldn't happen. Then everything could be dismissed as a prank or coincidence. But another part eagerly awaited answers to questions that multiplied with each hour. Sunday morning, October 27th, was gray and rainy. I didn't go to the flea market, but stayed home, nervously pacing around the apartment with a mug of tea in my hands. Great-great-grandfather's ring lay on the kitchen table. I didn't dare put it on, but couldn't put it away either. At 2:00 in the afternoon, the doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw a man about 50, with graying temples and kind brown eyes. He was dressed in a dark blue suit and held a leather briefcase. There was something familiar about his appearance, though I was sure I had never seen him before. The man introduced himself as Thomas Winters from the Genealogical Research Society, exactly as the letter had predicted. I invited him in, and we settled in the living room. Thomas carefully examined my apartment, his gaze lingering on the bookshelves. He immediately noticed the open Dr. Hartwell book on the coffee table and said he could see I had received the message from Joseph. Thomas explained that his family had been waiting for this moment for 109 years. Joseph foresaw this and created a system for finding lost descendants. Thomas explained the principle of this system. Joseph had hidden messages and artifacts in various places, knowing that the gift would manifest at the right time and lead the person to the right object. My book was one of such traps. Joseph knew that I specifically would find it on this specific day. Thomas took a photograph from the folder. It showed a man about 40 years old with intelligent eyes and a neat beard. Next to him stood a young woman with a baby in her arms. These were Joseph Edmonds, my great-grandmother Margaret, and my grandmother Elizabeth as an infant. The photo was taken in 1914. A year later, Joseph would die. Margaret would marry another man and change her surname, and Elizabeth would grow up not knowing her roots. I studied the photograph. The woman really resembled my grandmother, as I remembered her from family pictures. Thomas explained that his branch of the family had become keepers of the archives. For centuries, they had gathered information about scattered descendants, waited for the awakening of the gift, tracked signs. When Joseph was dying, he passed on to Thomas's great-great-grandfather a list of places where messages were hidden and descriptions of people who would find them. He showed me a sheet of paper with my description written in antique handwriting. Woman, 42 years old, architect, divorced, lives alone, loves old books, has scar on left knee, sleeps with stuffed bear. Thomas assured me that for a person with the gift of foresight, such accuracy was quite possible. Joseph could see the future 100 years ahead. Not all details, but key moments, definitely. He took out another folder, thick and heavy. It contained information about other Edmonds descendants around the world. Many of them don't even suspect their abilities. But from time to time, the gift awakens, and then they find each other. Thomas informed me that there were about 300 people in different countries. Most lead ordinary lives, but sometimes their intuition saves someone from trouble or prevents a catastrophe. They think these are coincidences. Those who know the truth are significantly fewer, about 50. They maintain contact, share information, help each other develop abilities, and they wait for special descendants, those in whom the gift manifests in full force. Thomas looked at me intently and said I was one of them. My abilities were just beginning to unfold, but he sensed enormous potential. Joseph hadn't chosen me for this mission by chance. He told me that in 3 days, on Wednesday, an event would occur in Portland that could cost many people their lives. A technological catastrophe at the Pacific Polymers chemical plant. An explosion in workshop number 3 at 2:47 p.m. My heart clenched at this information. He would help me. And he took a small velvet box from his briefcase, the Edmonds family amulet. It had belonged to Joseph, and before him, to many generations of our ancestors. Inside the box lay a pendant, a silver medallion with the same emerald as the ring, but larger. On one side was engraved a complex rune, on the other, an inscription in Latin, Lux in tenebris, light in darkness, our family motto. Thomas explained that this amulet would help me concentrate and enhance foresight. I took the pendant. As soon as the metal touched my skin, I felt a strange warmth spreading through my body. For a second, images flashed before my eyes. Smoke, fire, running people, a blocked road. Thomas noticed my reaction and confirmed. This was the beginning. The amulet creates resonance with my natural abilities. In a few days, I would learn to control visions. We sat in the living room until evening. Thomas told me about family history, explained how to develop the gift, taught concentration techniques. To my surprise, many exercises seemed familiar, as if I knew them intuitively. Thomas explained, this was ancestral memory. Abilities are transmitted not only through genes, but also through spiritual heritage. My subconscious remembers the knowledge of generations. Before leaving, he gave me his phone number and email address. Thomas planned to stay in Portland until Thursday. If I needed help, I could call any time. And tomorrow morning, I should start preparing for Wednesday. To my worried question about whether I could handle it, Thomas answered confidently, I would. Joseph never made mistakes in his predictions. If he chose me for this mission, it meant I was capable of completing it. After he left, I sat for a long time, with the amulet in my hands, trying to comprehend everything I had heard. My quiet life as an architect was over. Now I was Sarah Edmonds, heir to an ancient line of seers, keeper of the family gift, and in 3 days I would have to save 42 people from death. On Monday I took a day off work, claiming poor health. This was true. I really felt strange. The amulet I now wore under my clothes made the world around me brighter and clearer. I began noticing details that had previously escaped my attention. At Stamford Cafe, the barista looked tired and worried. Intuition told me he had money problems. A sick mother, expensive treatment. I left him a large tip and felt how surprised and pleased he was. On the street, I automatically avoided places where someone would stumble or fall in a few minutes. Premonition told me when to cross the road to avoid traffic jams or which route to choose to not get caught in the rain. But most importantly, I began seeing dreams about the chemical plant. Thomas explained that it wasn't necessary to penetrate inside. Sometimes a proper phone call or meeting with the right person was enough. My intuition would suggest the way, and if nothing worked out, we would try other options. For example, an anonymous message to emergency services. The main thing was not to despair. The night from Tuesday to Wednesday, I barely slept. Dreams about the explosion became so vivid that I woke up in cold sweat. At 6 a.m., I finally got up and began preparing for the most important day of my life. I hid the amulet under my sweater, put great-great-grandfather's ring on my right hand. I put all the documents Thomas had left in my bag and headed to the plant. On the way, I stopped at the same cafe where I had been the day before. At a table by the window sat a middle-aged man in work clothes with the Pacific Polymers logo. He was nervously smoking and constantly looking at his watch. Intuition told me this was my chance. I approached his table under the pretext that I was lost and looking for a bus stop. The man readily explained the directions, and I asked if he worked at that plant. It turned out his name was Jim Collins, and he had been working as a safety engineer at Pacific Polymers for 15 years. Noticing his worried appearance, I carefully asked if something had happened at work. Jim sighed and told me about problems in Workshop 3. For a week, pressure had been rising in the cooling system. He had reported to management, asked to stop production for equipment inspection, but was told that stopping would be too expensive. Orders were burning. Deadlines weren't waiting. I felt the amulet warming on my chest. This was exactly the coincidence Joseph had foreseen. Carefully asking about possible consequences of rising pressure, I learned that in the worst case, a pipe rupture could occur and toxic substances under high pressure circulated there. Explosion, fire, poisoning. But management claimed the system would hold. Supposedly the safety margin was large. Jim admitted he had been working with this equipment for 15 years and could sense when something was going wrong. And now something was definitely going wrong. When he wondered why a stranger was interested in their problems, I introduced myself as Sarah and said I was an architect working with industrial facilities and had experience in risk assessment. I suggested looking at their problem from the outside. Sometimes a fresh perspective helps find a solution. Besides, I lived in this area, and if something happened at the plant, it would affect me too. Jim thought about it and agreed. He had schematics and reports in his car. Maybe I really would see something they were missing. We went to his car, and Jim showed me the documents. The Workshop 3 schematic was exactly the same as in my visions. The same pipes, tanks, equipment layout. I felt a strange sense of déjà vu. How could he not have thought of this earlier? The tank needed to be checked manually immediately. He grabbed his phone and called his colleague Mike, asking him to urgently go to Workshop 3 and check backup tank section B physically, visually, despite sensor readings. Mike resisted, but Jim insisted this couldn't wait. Finishing the conversation, Jim looked at me gratefully and said he didn't know how to thank me. If I was right, I had just saved his colleagues' lives. I asked what would happen if the tank was really full. Jim answered that they would immediately stop production and release pressure in emergency mode. Better to lose a day of work than human lives. Jim's phone rang a few minutes later. Mike reported that the tank was completely full. Jim's face paled. He ordered immediate emergency shutdown and evacuation of everyone from Workshop 3. While he drove to the plant, Jim explained to me that the tank was filled to the brim. A little more, and what we had talked about would have happened. According to him, I had saved the plant. When we arrived at the plant gates, the territory was in chaos. Workers were being evacuated from Workshop 3. Emergency service vehicles were driving up to the building. Sirens wailed. People ran around with radios and tablets. When I asked about the seriousness of the situation, Jim answered that everything was very serious. According to calculations, the explosion would have occurred in about an hour and a half, at 2:45 to 2:50 p.m., right during shift change when there were the most people in the workshop. 2:47 p.m., exactly as Joseph had foreseen. I stayed at the gates, watching specialists eliminate the emergency. Jim disappeared into the crowd of engineers and managers. An hour later he returned, tired but with relief on his face. The crisis had passed. Pressure released. System transferred to safe mode. Tomorrow they would begin full diagnostics and repairs. But for now, everyone was alive and healthy thanks to our meeting. Jim thanked me and wondered how an architect could have such knowledge about chemical equipment. I smiled and answered that sometimes intuition is more important than knowledge. In the evening, I met with Thomas at the same cafe where I had met Jim that morning. He looked pleased and proud. Thomas congratulated me on my first successful mission. 42 people went home alive today, thanks to me. I objected that this was the merit of Joseph, Thomas, Jim Collins. I was just a link in the chain. Thomas agreed, but emphasized that I was the key link. Without me, the chain would have broken. He took another folder from his briefcase and asked if I wanted to know what else my great-great-grandfather had foreseen. I asked about other missions. Thomas explained that not all would be so dramatic. Sometimes it was enough to suggest the right decision to a person or warn about a small danger. Thomas handed me a business card with his permanent address in Seattle and contacts for the West Coast coordinator, Elizabeth Grayson. She was also in Edmonds, great-granddaughter of Joseph's cousin. Very experienced, would help with training. When I asked how often such situations as today occurred, Thomas explained that it differed for different people. Some encountered major events once every few years. Some helped people almost daily, but in small ways. Everything depended on the strength of the gift and life circumstances. We sat in the cafe until late evening. Thomas told stories of other Edmonds, a doctor from Chicago who prevented a meningitis outbreak at a school, a teacher from Florida who saved a class of children from a hurricane, a firefighter from New York who could sense fires before they started. In the end, Thomas summarized, "We are ordinary people with an extraordinary gift. We work, live, raise children, age. But when the time comes, we are ready to help." The next day, Thomas flew to Seattle, leaving me with a pile of documents, contacts, and instructions. I returned to work, but the world around me already seemed different. At the office, colleagues asked how I had spent my vacation. I joked around, but internally understood. My old life was in the past. Now I was Sarah Edmonds, keeper of the family gift, heir to an ancient line of seers. A week later, I received a letter from Jim Collins. He wrote that the investigation at the plant confirmed the seriousness of the accident that had been avoided. The faulty sensor in the tank hadn't shown the real liquid level for 2 weeks. The explosion would have been inevitable if not for the emergency check. Jim wrote that he didn't know how to thank me. I had saved not only his colleagues, but also himself from lifelong guilt. If he hadn't listened to me, 42 people would have died because of his inattention. I smiled reading the letter. Jim didn't know that inattention had nothing to do with it. It was simply time for the Edmonds gift to be needed by the world again. Great-great-grandfather's amulet was now always with me. Sometimes it warmed up, warning of danger, or suggesting that someone needed help. I learned to listen to these signals, trust intuition, act even when logic protested. Over the following months, I saved a homeless old man from hypothermia by telling a social worker where to look for him. I prevented an accident by calling road services about a damaged sign on a dangerous turn. I helped police find a missing child by simply sensing where he might be. Small things. But for each saved person, these small things were an entire world. A month later, I contacted Elizabeth Grayson in Los Angeles. She turned out to be an energetic woman about 60, a psychologist by training who had been helping Edmonds' descendants master their abilities for 30 years. Sometimes you could help just by listening to a person or giving a smile in a difficult moment. By New Year, I already considered myself a full-fledged keeper. Joseph's amulet had become part of me, and I reread the letter from 1915 like a family heirloom. On Christmas night, I had a special dream. I stood in a large library full of antique books. Next to me was a man with a beard, Joseph Edmonds, my great-great-grandfather. In the vision, he told me I had succeeded and now understood my purpose. I thanked him for the letter, for finding a way to contact me across a century. Joseph replied that time wasn't an obstacle for a true family. We are always close, even when it seems we are alone. He handed me a new book, the same one I had bought at the flea market, but without the letter inside, and explained, now it was my turn to leave messages for future generations. I woke up with clear understanding. My mission was just beginning. Somewhere, children were growing who would one day become new keepers. And when their time came, they too would find the right book, the right letter, the right person who would help them accept their gift. The circle closes. The Edmonds family continues its work, keeping light in darkness, helping those in trouble, preventing troubles that can be prevented. And I am proud to have become part of this story. This morning, exactly 1 year after buying the book at the flea market, I sat down to write a new letter, not to the past, but to the future, to my great-granddaughter or great-great-granddaughter who will be born in a few decades and one day find it between the pages of an old book. The letter begins with words that once changed my life. Dear girl, if you are reading this, It means the gift has awakened, and you are ready to learn the truth about our family. The story continues. And it will continue as long as there are people in the world who need help, and as long as there are those ready to provide that help. We are keepers. This is our purpose, our pride, our responsibility. And I wouldn't trade this life for any other.